Good evening. Hello, everybody. It is October 9th at 7 p.m., which is to say that it is 9 a.m. in Brisbane tomorrow. So I want to thank Judy Watson for joining us tonight on our Indigenous Peoples Day. It is an absolute pleasure to introduce Judy, a brilliant artist and friend, who is going to be giving us a wonderful overview of her artistic practice, and including, of course, the works currently on view at the Zimmerli Art Museum's exhibition Shadow Bone. I want to start by giving an overview or just her quick short bio for you. This is much truncated. She's an incredibly esteemed artist with a long biography, but I'll give you the short one here, and I encourage you to please Google Judy Watson. So Judy was born in Mundabera, Queensland. That is in the northwest or northeast of Queensland, Judy? I always forget.
No.
Okay. All right. You'll get to it.
All right. Queensland.
Got it. Okay. Judy Watson's Aboriginal matrilineal family is from the Waanyi country in northwest Queensland. Her process evolves from working from sight and memory, revealing Indigenous histories, following lines of emotional and physical typography that center on particular places and moments in time, spanning painting, printmaking, drawing, sculpture, and video. Her practice often draws on archival documents and materials such as maps and letters and police reports to unveil institutionalized discrimination against Aboriginal people. Her work is included in several significant Australian and international collections, including all of the Australian state institutions, the National Gallery of Australia, the Tokyo National University of Technology, the Taipei Fine Arts Museum, the British Museum, the MCA in Sydney, and the Tate Museum, and many, many more. Judy is also an adjunct professor at Griffith University, where I used to teach. And in 2018, she was awarded an honorary doctorate of art history by the University of Queensland. I want to just acknowledge our funding tonight. It is provided by the Middlesex County Board of County Commissioners through a grant award from the Middlesex County Cultural and Arts Trust Fund. And additional support is provided by the New Brunswick Parking Authority. I want to say also that this talk is part of a series about Indigenous art and culture, which along with Judy features Bentley Spang, Nikki Michael, Camilla Townsend, and Alan Michelson. So please check out our museum's website for further details. Please be sure also to enter any questions that you might have for Judy in the Q&A section, and we'll try to get to all of them by the end of the webinar. So Judy, thank you again for joining us, and I turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I would like to say that I'm a Waanyi woman from northwest Queensland. Our country is bitten or cut by the state borders of Queensland and the Northern Territory. I was born in Mundabera, which is in southeast Queensland, and I would like to acknowledge Yagara Turrbal peoples from this country where I am, and also to Indigenous peoples and people of colour and everybody over in your viewing circle where I'm speaking to you today and where my work is over in your country. So I'd like to begin by also thanking Mora and Zimmerli Art Museum for having my work over there, Shadow Bone. And I'd like to get straight into the PowerPoint, please. Okay, so the first image is of my grandma. My grandmother, Grace Isaacson, is there holding my mother, Joyce Watson. And this is a photograph would have been taken in Mount Isa. My grandmother was born in 1912 on Riversley Station. And this is the front cover of an artist's book under the Act. The artist's book suite of etchings was made by printing them onto banana fiber paper, shin collays with glue on the back of the paper, and then that sort of sandwiched, sitting on top of handmade cotton paper, and then fed through a press, an etching press, which is similar to an old washing mangle. And we'll talk about the act a little bit later. Next one, please. My grandmother, back in 1995, at that stage, I had won the Mot and Chandon, which meant a year in France, living there. And she was a very, very important part of my life. I still feel like she is an incredible matriarch of our family. She had a very hard life as well, living and working on pastoral stations, being separated by her family due to circumstances which were part of the colonial control of Queensland at the time. Next slide, please. This is Butchamulla, Lawn Hill. It's showing the tip of a canoe, which my sister was paddling, and it's part of a video that takes us through the gorge, which is fed by subterranean, very, very ancient water known as dinosaur water, which trickles up through fissures in the limestone and is known to be, you know, around the same time as the dinosaurs were around. So as it pops to the surface in a little bubble, it could be the same, that same water. It's incredibly lush down in the gorge itself, and on the edges of it, it is very harsh in places with spinifex growing. And in fact, Lawn Hill was called Lawn Hill because from a distance, the colonists thought that it had the appearance of a grass lawn, but in fact, it was a spiky spinifex. In fact, one of my, we say our cousin, Shirley McNamara, works with the spinifex in making beautiful vessels out of the runners from the spinifex along with ochre. So have a look at her work online as well. She also runs a cattle station, Mount Guide. There's also sandstone through the gorge here and lush verdant growth, very, very ancient trees, plant forms, and we have freshwater crocodiles and turtles and lots of fish through this gorge. It's a place where many Aboriginal people came through this gorge on the way from the Gulf of Carpentaria in the north and then down to the south. And it's said that some of the palms in this area are the same palms that have been taken and planted down in Palm Valley, down around Alice Springs, Monterey area. So it's a place of transition, but also a place of amazing culture. And in fact, my great-great-grandmother, Rosie, escaped a massacre at Lawn Hill. We don't know exactly where, but it would have been the 1880s, and she and another young girl rolled under a windbreak, which is a very fragile structure of plants, you know, sort of just to hold the wind out. Troopers came through. She was bayoneted through the upper part of her body and carried the wound for the rest of her life. And she and the young girl got down into the water, and they put rocks on top of their bellies and they breathed through straws, as in sort of, it would have been reeds. And that was how they were able to stay alive and escape the surveillance of the police. Next one, please. This is Ndari Falls on the right, and this is parts of the gorge. So you can see up the top, beautiful, you know, sort of snappy gum, various amazing species through here, and very, very ancient rock, you know, like billions of years old. And on the right, you can see the tufa, which comes from the limestone, depositing lime and building up, you know, these layers of history. Michael Ondaatje talks about limestone being the reef of memory because of the memories it holds within it. And I really think that in our country, when I go to these places and sit here and look out, there are these termite mounds, very, very ancient termite mounds, which I see as the guardians of our country and our people. Next slide, please. Next. Thank you. This is beautiful to canoe through, kayak through, swim through. There's my son Otis on the top of some of the sandstone rocks. When I was in my early 20s, I remember going here with some colleagues and looking at the site because it had been very eroded and desecrated by pig shooters and people coming through and leaving carcasses in this area. And the person from the North Queensland Conservation Council we were with, Adrian, was looking at it in terms of becoming a national park, which it did. And now it has been handed back to Waanyi people. Next, please. I'm not sure if the slides aren't moving through. Yeah, thank you. We can keep going through. Thank you. This is some of my family, my mum on the right and other family who were making string, cotton string for an exhibition sitting around at Adele's Grove and also in the back of the studio. So that idea of making string, in this case with cotton tree fibre, it could be other things, the way that you roll it in your hands and as you're making it, I think it carries DNA from the person who's making it, from the plant itself, and everybody, the way they make the string and the way that it forms, it's almost like a different signature, a different structure. Next, please. This work was made thinking about native places across Australia. Massacre Inlet, you know, there's Murdering Creek, there's Butcher's Creek, so many places, and they have a history behind them. This one was made with pigment over the top, and Massacre Inlet is a place up in the Gulf of Carpentaria where a massacre had occurred. So it's that idea often when I'm making the work where I'm thinking about it being like an X-ray of the body as an X-ray of the country, and that idea of being sometimes underneath looking up through country. Next. Waterline, the image of the spine on the left. Sometimes think about my grandmother's story where she said that when she was about 5 or 6, they were taken from Riversley Station by her mother, Mabel Daly, and there was another baby sister and younger brother, and they crossed rivers and creeks, evading police and violence that had happened on the station. A little bit like Rabbit Proof Fence, if you've seen that film of the young girls trying to get away. In this case, following the rivers and creeks when they could, her mother, Mabel, would be catching fish. And Grace, my grandmother, said about her mother, she said, she gave us the flesh off the backbone. She gave us the best of what she had. So that idea of the spine, the backbone, is something that I've used as a motif and continue to use, thinking about that strength and resilience of Aboriginal women and all women trying to hold culture and country and family as close together as they can. And this, the waterline sort of shape here too, thinking about the waterline of Woodjamala, Lawn Hill Gorge. Next, please. This is a work in the Brisbane Magistrates Court, just some of the public artwork that I have done where I looked at the shells, which are in the middens in the archives of the University of Queensland research around Moreton Bay. This work was made for the Brisbane Magistrates Court, and I was thinking of that idea of shells and when they are brought out of, you know, the water or the sand or the mud, feasted upon and then discarded and become these middens, and checked with the head of conchology or shells, etc., at the Queensland Museum, which ones would have been eaten, which weren't in the midden deposits that I found. And yeah, so things like the Baylor shell on the left, which I also have used as a motif many times because Baylor shells are were traded all the way down from New Guinea, the islands, the top and coastal areas of Northern Australia and around, and brought inland and used as drinking vessels. And I've actually seen them in inland wells as these beautiful shells left there as the cup for people to drink from. They were also used as receptacles for ochre and ceremony, painting up, and also, of course, for bailing water out of canoes. And to me, they're a very female form. There's many reasons why I have used them as a metaphor, an image of my grandmother, the matrilineal line of my family. Okay, next. Oh yeah, this one. Preponderance of Aboriginal blood. I was asked to contribute to an exhibition of women friends in Queensland, the history of it, as in women's right to vote. And I thought I wanted to look at Aboriginal people's right to vote. And the Department of Personal History, to do with the State Archives, were gifted these documents from descendants of their family who had them in their possession. And in many cases, it was trying to find out if they were able to vote. And a lot of the times they weren't because of their Aboriginality, if they were under the Act, the Queensland Aboriginal Protection of Restriction of Opium Act, all of these things, documents that prohibited them from voting, from owning property, from being able to marry who they wanted, from living outside of their area. And the black marks across here are redactions by the Queensland State Archives protecting supposedly family members or people. And in fact, when I made some of these prints to give to the descendants of this family of a particular woman, they were really annoyed that the blackout, sort of marks were there, because they were very proud of their ancestors. And so then I had to go back to the archives and get the unredacted work and then make it again to send it to them, so that they could have it in pride of place in their home. So these have been done as prints, and the etchings below were washes on copper plates, and then the documents were printed onto banana fibre paper through a photocopy process, and once again sheen collared with the glue on the back, and then stuck onto the outside paper through the printing process. Next, please. I should say too, the preponderance of Aboriginal blood, I'd never heard of that term. And one of the people asking if they were able to vote because they, were exempted from under the Act, et cetera, et cetera. Reply came, I don't fully understand your inquiry. Because you have a preponderance of Aboriginal blood, you are not entitled to vote. And that means Aboriginality through both sides of the family. On the left is, in this work here, is my imagined version of the windbreak that Rosie would have hid under. Windbreak meaning literally to stop the wind as they lay in their campsite. And the ochre on the floor, which was sourced locally for this particular installation in Adelaide, has then got salt, in fact, pool salt laid on it, because that's what I could get, in that particular place. And it's talking about salt in the wound, imagining the wound in Rosie's upper body. And that idea of that scarification or that psychic trauma of memory that carries through, not just in Rosie, but in all of us. And also that amazing fact that if she hadn't survived, we wouldn't be here. And ochre has been drawn, painted onto the wall over to the right there too, signifying the sorts of skirts made out of sometimes hair or fibre that the women and the men in our country would have worn. Next, please. Another event that happened on the station was Jack Watson, no relation to us, used to take the ears off Aboriginal people as a sign of retaliation for the spearing of cattle. And he had those nailed up to his slab hut homestead near Lawn Hill, Lilydale Station. And this was noted by Carolyn Cray, who was riding through as a young woman through the frontier, as she said, when she said that at Lawn Hill, she saw, as in that case, Lilydale, she saw not less than 40 pairs of blackfellas' ears nailed to the slab hut homestead. And, just sort of, this was just written sort of, just noted down in her diary. So I think it was quite commonplace. It was a very vicious man, despite being very well educated in Victoria. I think there was a lot of this change of heart, but maybe it wasn't really, for people who were coming up and dealing with what they saw as the Aboriginal problem, not seeing that they were actually the ones taking the land, killing the people, dispossessing the country, and water was very much at the heart of it. Next. This is a map of Queensland around Moreton Bay. The island form on the right is actually Moreton Island or Mulgulpin, and this is following the maritime maps showing where the oil spill had occurred back in 2009. And almost iridescent sort of look of the pigment behind is imagining the oil as it floats on water and catches the sunlight. And the worst thing with oil spills apparently is when they get into the freshwater lens through the creeks and rivers. So places like Moreton Island, Mulgulpin, Jelaba, any of the islands in the Barrier Reef, etc., have this almost like an elliptical sort of body of fresh water that sits on top of the salt water under the islands, and it's fed by rainfall, and it's what keeps life abundant in those places. So if the oil or any other toxicity gets in, that is what will kill off the life on the island and contaminate the water source. Okay, next. And this is another version of it too, and the Pacific Adventurer, which had lost its load, and you can see the shipping channels. On the left is Bribie Island, and once again, Mulgulpin here. Next. This is a map of the Brisbane River. You can see Kurilpa, the sort of triangular sort of shaped form at the top left coming down. Where it narrows down, that whole area is called Kurilpa. The narrow end is where Aboriginal people would, in locals, would drive the game, whether it was kangaroos, etc., from the wider section down to the narrower section, and then sort of, you know, capture it, because Kurilpa was a meeting place for groups from across the country when they had the Waanyi or Bunya festivals. And this is during the floods of 2011. So this is the flood maps, and down the bottom are images of financial charts on the day and at the time of the peak of the floods, and I've turned them upside down. Next. A picnic with the natives. That was one of the used for mass Aboriginal people in Australia. Picnic with the natives, dispersal, I won't even say the word, but NIGGER, hunt. You know, there were so many terms that were used very, you know, methodically throughout, you know, colonists and troopers' diaries, etc. And so this is a guy for Carpentaria using the Matthew Flinders map. Matthew Flinders circumnavigating Australia, and at this time up in Blue Mud Bay, he was there in about 1803. Okay, next. It's a public artwork at 200 George Street in the Runganangdama, Calm Water Dream, and it's incising sandstone with the map of the Tang Stream. So on the left, you can see the red map incised into the sandstone coming around, and that straightish line on the left is what was the Tang Stream, this beautiful pristine stream at the time of first colonisation, first contact, suddenly being overrun with houses and buildings, and the pristine stream became a sewer, an open sewer, where all sorts of garbage was thrown in, and the water source was contaminated. The stone form on the left is referencing a stone, a round stone that was found in the Tang Stream, and it was unknown what its origin was. The white shimmery form along the bottom is recognising the middens that were found all through parts of Australia, but there were heaps of them down on Bennelong Point, what's now known as Bennelong Point. And they were discarded oyster shells, and colonists harvested those shells, and they brought back rafts of them and burnt them to become the lime that was the mortar between the early sandstone buildings. So I think about how that idea of the shells being within the buildings, and you can still see them down in the rocks in Sydney in some of the old buildings. It's like the DNA of those Aboriginal people who have collected and harvested, and shucked and swallowed those oysters. That DNA is within the oyster shell, and so it is literally within those are old buildings holding them together. The netted bag on the right at the bottom is one that I saw at the British Museum that had been taken in some of the early fleets going back to the UK. And it's had its DNA analysed, and it's from the brachykite and Illawarra, not necessarily Illawarra, but one of those Currajong trees. It's so beautiful, but once again, and it's labelled as being from Port Jackson. I think about these objects being away from country and culture. Next, please. This is research working on the left here with Lisa Carmichael and looking at tow row nets in the Queensland Museum. I was interested in using a netted form at the front of the Queensland Art Gallery. And at this stage, I had the commission. I'd run into Lisi, she was doing something at the State Library, I think, and we were talking about nets. And so I said, do you want to come on as a young emerging artist and working with me on the project. So we're looking at nets. Some of these nets, like the one I'm holding up there, might be from Doomadgee. I think it was because of the yellowish colour of the fibre, which is from our area. And you'll see how this then transpired. Next. So this is a bronze net out the front of Goma, and looking at thinking about those nets and how they were used in Maiwar, the Brisbane River, which is just down from the gallery there. But I wanted to make something which was very fragile and ephemeral looking, so you could look past it and through it and see the environment and the surrounds. And in fact, you can go online and look at Judy Watson digital tow row, and they've made a sort of like a whole 3D, sort of online rendering of what life was like before, what it's like now, and trying to think back to culture and country, and realising that when you are in these places, there are Aboriginal walking tracks going past this area, Montague Road, etc., that you are walking in our ancestors' footprints. Next. This is how I use some of the string that has been made and float it across the top, projecting it and painting it in my works. The forms behind it, the two white sort of outline forms, are actually bodies of water that were melting in Japan. So I'm sort of thinking about water and its importance in countries around the world, especially with global warming, climate change, and pastoral practices, acidification of our oceans, sea surface temperature rising, coral bleaching. It's affecting both freshwater and salt water. Next. And the spine-like form here is actually from the bunya leaf tree, and the objects behind are from kangaroo teeth necklaces. So a lot of work that I've looked at in British and overseas museums and local museums holding Aboriginal culture, and thinking about how these objects have been taken and displaced. Next. This is thinking back to what it must have been like for my great-great-grandmother. And the younger girl she was with too. They were both young girls, you know, sort of lying beneath the water and, you know, with the reeds to breathe through. So I've got the sort of the image of the reeds at the bottom there, water, light, reeds, and all of those language words behind are, so Waanyi is water, and they're trying to sort of bring back our language, our Waanyi language. Next, please. This is the Great Artesian Basin Springs, the Gulf, Jewel, you know, water jewel, Waanyi, water. And this is using indigo dye on canvas, and it shows a map of the springs. And in fact, that after first contact, when this map was drawn, 80% of the springs in the Gulf of Carpentaria are no longer working. And that could be interference, you know, climate change. I know that in our area, some of the pastoralists have actually, you know, tried to blow up and dynamite the springs to get them going, which totally, you know, eradicates them. Next. This is one of the very, very small falls. It's like a little prawn sort of, which is actually living in water in mine pools. So it's that whole idea of disappearing springs, you know, with mining, invasion, incursion, fracking, what that is doing to our water rights. Next. This is a work that's been made for Sydney University, thinking back to that beautiful basket, which was, you know, it's in the British Museum, but was taken from Sydney. And this was at the launch of it. Next, please. And since then, this has been planted with lots of species that are then coming up through the basket. It's near a wellness, or, you know, sort of a hospital research site at University of Sydney. And so it's been planted with all the sorts of things that the women in the local area, Gadigal women, would have pulled up, you know, sort of and harvested in their dilly bags. So now it's a feast of growth. Next. Next, please. Thanks. This made a whole lot of work, yeah, with COVID graphs and atmospheric graphs, talking about what I call psychic stars of the COVID graphs, and also scientific data, you know, talking about what is happening within our area, you know, so much impact. Yeah, it's terrifying. Next. And more of the COVID graphs. Next. I'm just aware that I've got to get through before Q&A. So this is once again memory scar with grass, you know. So as I was walking around during COVID times, I'm not sure how you all went over where you are, or in your place where you were living during COVID lockdown times, but we were able to walk out and around, and I was picking up things from their local environment. And at the same time, I think, receiving these psychic scars of how are we, our family, our friends, our colleagues, how are we going to get through this? This, yeah, the Banks, Joseph Banks was on, you know, the boat coming over to Australia, to Sydney, Botany Bay, etc. And, you know, some of these, the Banksia species are named after him. But those people were not necessarily just researchers and botanists. You know, he had other things that he was trying to do too. It was very much a subjugation of Aboriginal people, the idea of imposing terra nullius and basically wiping out the Aboriginal population to gain access to land and water resources. This is a silhouette of my mother across country, including a lot of the pastoral properties, as in stations, cattle stations, and places that are part of her memory. The white area outside of her is a little bit like the way that anthropologists used to line Aboriginal people up and take their photographs, measure their heads, that whole scientific analysis of a dying race, and the sort of almost explosions or trauma within her country, within her head. Next. I did a silhouette of others as well. So this is myself. Next. My daughter Rani with freshwater mussel shells. Next. They're called malu malu in our area, kangaroo grass. This is a Carpentaria petition signatories. You can see the signatures there, where there were local people around the places where my grandmother was born and my family lived and worked. We're protesting that Aboriginal people should not be paid at all, and they should be moved off the stations to allow the white boys to come in. So basically pushed off their country. And the earth in this case has been trampled and danced into the canvas. Next. I'll just go through these quickly. This is once again the Flinders map of Australia, Terra Australis, Gulf of Carpentaria. Broken country, blacks not to be trusted. This is Walter Roth. You can see I've highlighted blacks not to be trusted. In fact, my mother wanted to be placed over this map, but it didn't quite fit aesthetically for me. But he was a protector, and he was trying to work out feeding places where you would sort of put gather Aboriginal people together to once again subjugate them, control them into places around the country so that the squatters could take over. Next. This is some of my work at the Art Gallery of New South Wales for the National. Clouds and Undercurrents. Next. Some of them have got scientific charts, and they've moved with the wind and the ventilation as people move through. Next. This is how some of the works start. They go through an eco-dye process where you wrap up material with materials, and the slightly darker marks on that canvas below, that's my nephew above, he makes knives, does the forging, and so that's some of the iron filings from the knife making process in there wrapped up. Next. And this is also how I go about doing the shibori or indigo dyeing, or wrapping things up together and then putting them in the dye bath. Next. So it's also about resistance and really playing with materials. This is how some of those works were shown in the environment with often scientific data to do with climate change and what was happening in the country. This was in the Sunshine Coast hinterland. Next. Next, please. Yep. And this is also, you'll see this one later. This has then been overlaid with indigo dye, working through it. This is how I work in the studio, and sometimes, trace charts and things like that. And then people come in and work on it together. People lie on the work. You can see one of my art assistants said, painting in the maps. If I've got a deadline, I bring family and friends in to work together. Next. And this is how this work appears, with the spectrogram at the bottom talking about gila, which is the word for light-coloured honeybee, the freshwater mussel shells, the map of the Brisbane River, and on the right is the chart from the Brisbane Airport Authority flying over Moreton Bay. Next. Now we might just go through fairly quickly, because Maura, do you want to ask me questions while I'm going through here, or will we stop showing images? or can I just keep showing them?
Oh, you can just keep showing them. Take your time, Judy.
Oh, okay, all right. So this is the Brisbane River in sort of like ochre and blood, and on the left is the small creek, Oxley Creek, moving across, and the spectrogram again of Gila or native honeybee. And you can see those darkish marks once again from the eco-dyeing process, which is a lovely process to try because as you unroll the work, all the material like the eucalyptus leaves and everything you've bundled in there falls out, and you get this amazing, beautiful eucalyptus smell from the ingredients. And the casuarina here, well, there's many things about the casuarina. Some of them allude to the windbreak, some to the fires which were raging across Australia at this time, raging again, the fire, flood, extraction of water. All of these things are affecting us, and I know they're affecting your countries over there as well. I just saw the flooding in New York recently and thought about, some of those hidden waterways that I know exist in that area, and how at certain times they will suddenly start, seeping up and re-emerging, because water has a memory. It doesn't go away. It follows its, sort of across indentations, and sort of it follows that water line, and it will always come back. Next. This one is a sentinel to my father. This is the Waanyi leaf. We'll go on. Yeah, keep going. And this is the rivers of the Gulf. This one is research I did about the Barra shell fish hooks made from turbine shells and other shells in the Sydney area. But of course, we have shell hooks everywhere. But the Gadigal women in this area used to use them on their canoe, or keep going, and they would be feeding the colony with the fish that they bought. Yep, they caught. Yep, here we go. Next one. Next one, please. Yep. And this is my work called Monument to the Eora, called Barra. And this is a sentinel form thinking about those women, Gadigal women, in that area of Sydney, Warrane, feeding the colony, and you sitting up on that headland. You've got Government House behind you. So this is asserting Aboriginal presence in the front of Government House, looking out over Sydney Harbour, Warrane, and you see the Opera House on this case to the left, and you see Sydney Harbour Bridge in front of you. And it's lit according to the light of the moon, because Utzon, who designed the Sydney Opera House, wanted it to be lit according to the light of the moon. So this echoes that. All right, next. Right, the holes in the land. So this is some work which is in the exhibition. This is showing a paddle on the left and some clubs and the floor plans of the British Museum. And then on the right, you have these shapes of almost like human head shapes, but they're pitchery bags. And, the blood going through the museum, thinking about the incision of, I think of the floor plans being the bones of the work, and these shadowed forms. It's almost like they're out of body, and it's imagining those hollowed presences back in the country culture that they've come from, been taken from. The next one. There's more pitchery bags on the left, and on the right, the hairstring skirts and fibre skirts, once again with different parts of the British Museum's floor plans. Next. And the blood on the left here. And in fact, that is, you know, sort of the waterways, the mapping. And on the right, the plans for, you know, these cases, you know, which sometimes would be showing our bones, our hair, our skin in these, you know, vitrines. The pitchery bags were native tobacco. Pitchery has a hallucinogenic effect, and it was highly prized by Aboriginal people in Australia. In fact, it was the most sought after resource. And so people in those areas around Boulia, etc., were said to be the richest in Australia because everybody wanted what they had. And people would carry those pitchery bags on their head or behind them on really long walks on all the Aboriginal trade routes across Australia, which then became drovers' routes, which then became major highways and arterial roads. Next. Experimental beds. On the left, we have Richard Bell and Lindsay T.H. Jackson, who I met while she was taking Pilates class in Brisbane. She has Native American and or First Nations and African American origins, and I felt like she and Richard were like the Corgi and Bess for this work, talking about Thomas Jefferson. This is the floor plans of the University of Virginia, which he drew. Here on the above, on the left, squash, which were in the gardens, and at the bottom, some of the objects retrieved during the archaeological discoveries, that leading from, you know, there's the slave quarters, and on the right you have the nails. So some of the and the first, so some of the young boys on Jefferson's plantation were set up in a nailery from the ages of 9 years and probably younger and up, just, you know, bashing out nails. So Jefferson was always after some sort of a cash, you know, sort of a situation, whether it was trying different foods, vegetables, nail making, all these different sort of products in order to increase his monetary flow. He's had a lavish lifestyle, and he never freed any of his slaves. He had children with 4 of his enslaved women, not just Sally Hemings. There's a great book, Master of the Mountain, that talks about this, and others as well. Okay, next. Jamie Hubbard was one of the slaves who tried to run away from Jefferson, and he was whipped and escaped eventually with the watermen on the Jameses River. On the left is the elk antlers, which are in the enclosure of Monticello. If you go there, you know, Jefferson's house, place of residence. And once again, the nails, different images that I observed and drew when the archaeologists were picking them out on their buckets when I went through with Margot Smith on a visit. And the things that look like scissors are actually fasteners that the women would have held onto, you know, sort of their dresses, etc. And I think about experimental beds not just being Jefferson's turn of trying out different crop rotations within his place at Monticello, but also, you know, all the bed hopping that occurred, you know, leading to many children with his slaves and with, you know, all the other white men, and that includes my family, to pastoral, you know, cattle stations all through Australia and other places where you have a dominant, so-called dominant race, so-called, who feel that they can enslave and impregnate, you know, sort of the women and the children, you know, sort of who are subjugated underneath them. And so that's where I sort of feel like every time I sort of see these stories played out across countries and cultures around the world, I think back to my own family, my own family's history and my matrilineal family. on the right, you have the library and the steps of the library where many politicians have had their photographs taken. But I sort of think about it in terms of who built the library, who built these buildings. Often it was enslaved people. Next. And to me, this, you know, the floor plan of the library is very much a phallic form, you know, sort of showing the shape of the library. Okay, next. The pitchery bags, this is from the keepers. As I said, these were actually made by using government issued blankets. So blankets were issued to Aboriginal people. Sometimes they, you know, had poison within them, and a lot of people who were given the blankets then died of diseases because they were no longer using their possum skin cloaks or their kangaroo skin cloaks, which actually kept you know, the wet out, the rain out, etc. And in fact, you know, led to many deaths. Areas all around Australia. So the government issued blankets were then repurposed. I love this idea, this repurposing of them to hold the pitchery. Next. And this is from Shadowbone. I think there's 2 images of the video. So this is documented drawings by Oscar, a young Aboriginal boy who witnessed the native police, which was actually led by non-Aboriginal men to massacre and frighten Aboriginal people who were resistant to colonisation. And then he, as a young boy, was then taken to work on cattle stations over where my family were living. Okay, next. Okay. Is there anything you would like to ask me, Laura? And while we're talking, do you want to run through images or just ask questions?
I think I wanted to just make a few comments. First of all, that wow, I mean, Judy, it's so amazing to see the historical trajectory of your work and to hear you speak about. I mean, I know the amount of imagery that's involved in the prints and in all of the works that you produce, but to hear you walk through the toro nets, the skeletal forms, the shells, the maps, the Banksia leaves, the mussel shells, but all your reasonings behind them is just, they're so poignant and so profound, right? Like each object that you choose is just so specific and well thought out. And I just loved hearing you talk about that. So thanks for that. I did want to also point out how blown away I am by the public art. I've seen none of it. So for me to see Bara and the Toro nets and Juguma are just, they're just extraordinary, and I hope to get to see them in person. I think the Bara about the Gadigal women, and you're explaining how they're asserting their Aboriginal presence in downtown Sydney, is particularly profound. So I look forward to seeing those in person, I hope at some point. I also wanted to thank you for letting us know the other meaning behind the title of the print series, Experimental Beds. I had not read about that anywhere, and to your discussion of the kind of dominant white male race sexually abusing and impregnating subjugated peoples and experimenting in these beds is also just adds like just a whole other layer of just like incredible, just upsettedness for me, for lack of a better phrase. But that's pretty profound. I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about your experience at the British Museum with the keepers, because it's hard to really get that across without seeing the video. So for those that haven't seen it, it's just to walk us a little bit through that journey for you, because you just showed that one image, and I don't think that capsulates, you know, just the complexity of that piece, of that video.
Yeah, I think it's a mournful cry from the objects, you know, to be back. And I think of the way the objects would have come over. And if you think of some of those objects, you know, like the hair string, or, you know, made with parts of the body, or the fiber that's been, sort of taken and then twisted through the fingers, rolled along the thigh to make the string for those objects. It carries our old people's DNA. So it's like the old people's DNA is hiding within the skirts and, the other objects, and it's over there. And I think they're crying to come back. And as you go through, the video sort of takes you through, it's almost like a shuddering through the portals of the British Museum into the museum space itself. And then it's like a chattering from the objects. There's also photographs of people, and there's one woman in particular who really looks back at the viewer, and she is really, I think, retaliating with her gaze and saying, "Get me out of here, but how dare you?" And there are, people, a male and a female, who have got measurements next to them. There are the sounds of the objects being taken out of the boxes. So as they come out, the tissue paper crackles and whispers, and it sort of, if you take it out, it continues going. That sound keeps going. It's looking at that and thinking of, it's a displacement of those objects. I had Gay Sculthorpe, who's a Tasmanian Aboriginal woman, taking me. I called her the Black Insider at the British Museum, because she was able to take me through, and other Indigenous people from Australia through, and show us our heritage, our culture, or ones close to us. And she is the person who's actually holding the stone tools, and the way she cradles them in her hands, you can see she absolutely knows what they are, and then she places them carefully back into the box. And so it's that whole idea of cultural retrieval that I think that I make when I'm working with those objects or imagery from our country. It's like a cultural retrieval, bringing them back across to us. And even though the objects might not be there, and the indentations of where they've been taken are still a hovering presence, the more that we can do to try and get them back, the more of a closing of that cycle of taking. I talk about sort of, the making of the objects and the taking of it. They're sort of, how did they get there? Were they stolen? Were they exchanged? Were they bartered? I've seen some heartbreaking things, and sometimes there's another video, Invasion, which I've got the objects almost snaking across sites of significance in the UK, thinking about a reverse colonisation.
And is there any conversation about those works returning? I mean, we hear so much about repatriation of the Benin bronzes and Parthenon marbles, but are there any conversations about some of that Aboriginal material and those spiritual objects returning to the First Nations people of Australia?
Well, I'm not the best person to ask, but I do know this is just through what I've read or what I've heard from colleagues, that, for example, Cambridge Museum, they returned some of the spears that were taken in the First Fleet. Many were taken. And I just sort of think about that. They take so long to make these objects, and then, colonists come through and think, oh, okay, that looks nice. I'll just take those. And suddenly, then you've got to spend all this time making them again. But it's just sort of like to feel that you can just walk in and take something, take country, take culture, take implements. So they have been returned. Some objects have been returned on short-term visits, and it's better than nothing. But as a woman in the audience, when I was talking at the British Museum back in 2013 in a panel discussion, she said, okay, so if they're not going to return the objects, what about paying the rent? And Gay Sculthorpe and I went, pay the rent, yeah. So it would be really interesting if there's an object in a museum, if it could be rented. I'm not saying that's the best outcome, but just imagine if a small amount of money going from that that object back to the community that it came from, that then could fund, maybe it's a workshop of reimagining sort of, cultural material in that area, which could then possibly be bought and come back over. I don't know. I just sort of think you could set up a web, like a spider web, of objects and ideas and imagery going back and forth that then sets up for future generations, like this traveling train, like little ants moving across, like the internet, of cultural exchange as well as monetary exchange.
I love that. I love that idea. I think that's so smart. And so people pay the rent, they pay to use the First Nations objects, right? We'll let you keep them as long as you pay us, to some degree. So we have a few questions. I want to turn to those. So Brandon Truitt is asking or saying, first of all, thanks for the wonderful talk. I'm fascinated by your description of your practice as an X-ray of the body or X-ray of country. It seems that work also X-rays the materiality of history, such as a variety of archival materials. Could you please elaborate more on how your art currently on view at the Zimmerli addresses archives and their effects on Indigenous peoples?
Well, I think, Marcia Langton talked about how Queensland Aboriginal people were the most documented Indigenous people in the world. And as a Aboriginal person, it's a burden that, all that material is there. But as an artist, and I just mean artist in the broad term, it's also this vast, array of material that we can work with. And by working with that material, we're bringing it out of the archives, out of the, the bowels of those places, and bringing it up for people to see, both to understand who we are, our history, our memories, and how our people were treated, but also to reimagine and work with that. And in fact, at the moment, the Queensland State Archives, a lot of these places are often gatekeepers, but they've suddenly, at this stage, and who knows if that will keep happening, they are opening the doors. And there was an exhibition of my work curated by Amanda Heyman, who's an Aboriginal woman herself, and that has brought in lots of teachers, students to those places. And to me, growing up, I hadn't been in museums or libraries or things like that much at all. And it was quite scary coming in. But I think it's, once again, younger generations and everybody who starts feeling like they can go in, they can learn about those histories. And in learning, that is when people become enriched and educated. And I think that's what will overcome racism. It's ignorance often comes from what you don't know and what you're scared of. But once you start to know, and once you start to say, oh, so I met an Aboriginal person and this is what they said, those little things, it's engagement beyond what you read and what you might see or hear in pretty despondent, and ugly, whether it's shock jock, journalism, etc., but actually meeting somebody and sharing empathy. I think that is the key to understanding. And one of the best ways I've seen that happening is the Mile Creek Massacre is a really important, well-known massacre in Australia. In 1838, 28 Aboriginal, mostly women, children, and a few old men were massacred by white men in the area near Inverell, Bingara, Mile Creek. And they, every year, on the day, around the day of the massacre, people come together who were descendants of both the perpetrators and descendants of the survivors and other people as well. And they come together and they walk and they talk and they spend that time. And I think if we had more of that, there would actually be a shared history and understanding of what actually occurred here. And I'm by here, I'm in Australia, and I would say the same for other countries around the world who've had these complex, multi-layered histories. To me, you have to learn from the ground up to know what's happening now.
a beautiful story, and building empathy. That's
Mm.
absolutely, it's the key, I think, to the future of unlocking racism and these horrific histories. So I had another question for you, and that is from Claire D'Amato. Do you have a favorite medium that you work with, or is it a combination of media that you prefer?
Yeah, probably a combination of media. I love, for example, lithography. I don't do it very often, but I used to teach it and work with it. And that idea of, putting the touche, which is resistant to water, on limestone and letting it reveal itself as it dries, like the tide goes out and leaves these ripples of touche. And I think with a lot of the work that I make, it's the alchemy of something, things that are unexpected. So I could go ahead and sort of, do something which is I know exactly how to do, but it's the things that I don't know how to do that occur within the process, whether it's printmaking, whether it's indigo resistant dyeing, or the eco dyeing, or anything else. And being playful, and I think video can be the same too, where you have all of these different research materials that you bring together and you throw them together. And I want to get something which is has an ephemeral, it's a seductive nature to it. So then it pulls you in. You don't know exactly what it is, and you're looking. And the harder you look, suddenly it will explode in your chest and leak its contents. And that's what I'm attracted to when I'm looking at work. It's something that I'm curious about. It's not on the surface, and I want to know more about it. And suddenly it gets its hook into me and pulls me in. And that's what I want my work to do.
Well, that's exactly what it does do. Absolutely. Just as an aside, and I think it's important for the audience to know because they might not follow Aboriginal politics or what's happening with First Nations people in Australia. Can you just tell folks about what the referendum is and why it's so important? It's happening next week, right? If you could just tell folks here a little bit about that.
Well, as Senator Briggs says, and he's not a real senator, but he is in his community, just Google it. So Google Senator Briggs and where he's trying to tell people what the voice is. He said, just Google it and it will tell you. Basically, it's something which is talking about a constitutional change, and there's a referendum, and people have the choice of saying yes or no about giving voice to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and giving them a voice on the constitutional platform, and the voice will give recommendations to the government, and the people who are represented have to then go back to grassroots community. It's not going to affect your backyard. It's not going to take away from you as non-Aboriginal people in Australia. It's about giving more voice to Aboriginal people, but there are also groups within the Aboriginal community, and I say community in a broad sense because not everybody thinks the same way. Some people want a treaty first, and some people don't believe that the voice will give any more control or options to Aboriginal people. And then there are people on the no vote who are all about, what's concerning themselves, or saying that, like Jacinta Price, who say that colonisation was a great thing for Aboriginal people and gave us everything that we want, and which I totally am against. I think, sure, I mean, I've got Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal family and ancestors, and it does not mean that Aboriginal people deserved to have land taken away from them, children taken away from them, desecration of their bodies and their culture, their waterways, absolutely horrific histories of bloodbath, rape, slaughter, dispossession. So colonisation is not the answer. And in fact, I think we should be looking back at, and people all over the world are, at what are better processes of working with our country, with how we make our livelihoods, how we treat each other, and there's not one way. So I am a yes for the referendum, but I also don't, I'm not going to sort of go into, I'm never going to speak to somebody again if they're on the no side. It's like all of these things. People will have their own reasons, but I am certainly supportive of a voice for Indigenous people within the Constitution. If you want to know about it, Google it. It will lay it all out there. And if it does happen, great. But I've seen many times when it hasn't happened. And in fact, the referendum, back in the 60s was a very important one. I've been involved in others for the Franklin Dam, for various environmental things too. None of us always get what we want, but we have to keep fighting for change and fighting for better possibilities for the future for all of us. Yeah. And this is one of them, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's hugely important. Everyone I know who's Australian is talking about it and how important this vote is. So thank you for giving folks here just a quick overview of that, because it's so important. I had one last question, and it comes from Raven Manygoats. And she's asking, as an artist, how do you approach your archival research? Do you come into the archive with materials in mind for the project you're working on? Or do you let the archive materials sort of speak to you? You find and find shape in your art, or is it a mixture of both?
Yeah, the second answer is the one. I'm led by curiosity, and I'm led by something I might see, going on the train and look out the window and see a poster or a word or something that leaps out from a book. So I'm led by these transitory things. At the same time, I have to do my work, like you do your homework, your research, and things will float up towards you. So I talk about the artist, you throw the net out, certain things will be there, you draw it back in, and then you pick out the things that you think will be of interest. And you can always throw your net out again and get something completely different. But that's what you're doing as the artist all the time, or the writer, everybody else. You're the person who makes those decisions, and they won't always be the right decisions, but then you just have to keep going. But the second answer is a really good one, Raven. Thank you for that.
That's fabulous. Well, great. So Judy, we've taken up enough of your time. I want to thank you for sharing all of your insights and this wonderful overview of your work. I wish that we had a way for folks to clap. I'm not sure that we can open up the webinar, but I'm sure everybody's clapping. I will clap for the group at large that's joined us this evening. And thank you again. And thank you so much for allowing us to show your work at the Zimmerli. It's a real pleasure.
It's an honor for me, and happy birthday, Maura.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all
right.
for coming.